Good afternoon. Welcome, providers and evaluators, special educators. This is Data Driven IEP Development, Part 3. You are in the right session if you are a related service provider, other service provider, or a psychologist. Today's session will be the third and final installment of our Data Driven IEP Development series. I wanted to give you a recap of the series before we went ahead and got started. Last year, we dove into data in the present levels of performance and how to collect that data and demonstrate that data in the IEP. This fall, we moved on to identifying measurable annual goals and progress monitoring those goals that are linked to the data in the present levels of performance. And today, in the final installment, we are going to be looking at supplemental aids and services, including program accommodations, testing accommodations, and even special transportation, and how that links back to the data that we put in the present levels of performance in our IEPs. Just wanted to let you know that this session has really been tailored to meet the needs of our district. And what we've done to prepare today is we've reviewed some feedback that we've received from NYSED's Office of Special Education Quality Assurance. And with that guidance and feedback, we have been able to put this presentation together for you today. You're going to hear a little bit about that from one of our Associate Directors of Compliance, as well as from the rest of the team. I did want to let you know that there are some resources that you will already have access to that might help you as you're viewing the presentation. You did receive an email from me this morning with the presentation slides themselves if you would like to jump into Google and follow along with us. There is also a link to a parking lot form, which you can submit a question that you have either as you're watching the presentation or after the presentation ends. If you'd like to submit a question to us, we will take the questions in that format, as we're not able to answer those questions live on the air today, as we won't have enough time, but we do want to get that response to you. So please use that parking lot. Please follow along in the presentation if that's what works for you. If you are having a hard time accessing either one of those documents, please reach out to me. In my away message today, there's all the links that you might need for the presentation right there if you might not have received that email. Also, and I'll remind you of this at the end of the presentation as well, everyone must complete the survey at the end of the day, which is not live yet, but will be after this presentation, to document their attendance. And I'll speak about that again at the end of the presentation, but it is located on the Superintendent's Conference Day website that was shared by Communications and the Office of Professional Learning. So more to come on that at the end. I just wanted to make sure that we said it right in the front, because I know in your mind you might have some questions about those things. So I wanted to get that all out there. Without further ado, we will get started. I will introduce your presenters for this session. I'm Amy, and I also have with me some fabulous presenters. I have Shannon Markin. Shannon is an Associate Director of Special Education, who you might know from your school. She is also a chairperson for Committee on Special Education meetings, and in addition to that, has a significant focus on improving instruction and behavior in our special ed programs across the district through PD. So she's working hard on that. We have Shannon D'Agostino. Shannon is a teacher coordinator of special education. She also is a CSA chairperson. In addition to that, does a lot of support and coaching in our special ed programs on instruction. And last but not least, we have Eugene McNamara. Gene is the Associate Director of Compliance for our district. He works closely with our Quality Assurance Office from New York State and works to keep us compliant in all areas. Right now, we're currently working through some corrections of some IEPs through the corrective action process. So he's going to talk a little bit about that, and we are going to look at our agenda. Shannon's going to go through our agenda today, and then we'll kick off the rest of this session.
Hey everyone, we are so happy to be here today presenting to our related service providers. As we put together this presentation today, and I hope that you'll see some of the feedback that we've been given from NYSED, we really wanted to bring our related service providers together. So as you see, our agenda today will begin with some feedback from CEQA, and then we will continue to review some other components and really deepen our knowledge of the information that Jean's going to share today and how we can apply that as related service providers. as we develop IEPs. So with no further ado, I'm going to let Jean take it away with some feedback from CEQA.
Thank you, Shannon. Good afternoon, everyone. Gene McNamara. I'm the Associate Director of Special Education Compliance for the district. I'm going to give a little bit of background that I want to share with everyone. So many of you already know that we were under a review last year. What had happened was we had this special education quality assurance team come in, and they provided us with some technical assistance in the beginning of the year. And they basically took a look at our IEPs, our writing process, and then that turned into a state review. And when they were done with their state review, we had provided them with at least 30 or more IEPs and different documentation. And from that review, we ended up in a corrective action plan, working with CEQA to try and get our IEPs into compliance. And initially, the submission and the feedback that we had gotten from the state had really talked about the alignment of our present levels and our goals. We did several submissions throughout this year. The last submission was March 1st, and we did get some very good feedback on improvement. So I do want to let staff know that. We still have some areas that we're focusing on, and I will talk about where we're heading from there. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to really talk to you about the basic areas of the IEP in which the state reviewed and found that we were non-compliant and that we're working on improving. And so these areas needed immediate attention and continue to have some professional development built around that. And it works and moves right into our trainings that we're doing right now for part 3 on the IEP writing. So the first area that the state looked at was our present levels of performance, and they did not have current baseline data in those present levels that matched with the goals. So we have to address that. We had to look at that carefully. The next step and next piece that they looked at was our academic and our management needs. And again, they did not align with the present levels, the descriptions that we gave for our students, and they did not align with the goals. So we have to make sure that we address that as well. I'm going to give you some samples in a little bit of how that is connected. The next piece they looked at obviously was our goals, and our goals did not align with the present level data. It did not align with our needs. And in many cases, our goals were not measurable or observable. And so the state gave us some guidance, gave us some recommendations as well as to how we can address those moving forward. The one of the last sections on the IEP is our supplemental aids and supports programs and accommodations. And once again, they were looking at that with the alignment to our goals, to our present levels, and to our management and academic needs, and they did not see an alignment. I'm going to talk about some specifics of why they were not aligned and really some of the areas that they said we should be addressing as to how to write some of the ways that we implement those accommodations. And lastly, they had us take a look at the effect of our student needs, which is a statement that we have that describes the disability and how it impacts involvement and progress for the student in the general education curriculum. And that didn't necessarily match with the student's disability or the descriptions that we were providing. So we're going to address some of that as well. Next slide, please. So this brings us to our learning objectives for the day. And basically, when you're done with today's presentation, you should be able to understand the difference between non-compliant, compliant, and quality IEP. We're also going to be able to construct an evidence-based IEP in which the present levels and the performance justify the needs that we put on the IEP. And then lastly, you will be able to show an alignment throughout the entire IEP from the present levels, the needs, other statements that we put in there, the goals, supplemental, the student statement needs, and even services provided for a student. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some feedback specifically to show where CEQA was looking at our IEPs and how they were aligned. And I'm going to just give some examples. They're not end-all examples. They're just to show you some of the alignments and some of the areas that will lead to the rest of the training for today, which will give you some more details on what to put into these sections. Next slide, please. Okay, so when we take a look at aligning our present levels to our students' needs, we have to make sure that the present levels include some descriptions of the student, what the student can currently do, areas they need to improve on, and we have to have some baseline data in there. So I'm just going to read a basic statement. Now, this is, again, for the service providers that are here. This is not a complete description of a present level, but it's a snippet, and it's really used to just show the alignment. But there's more information that I know you provide. We do a very good job of describing our students' needs. We just do a good job of describing what they can do, and we just need to incorporate a little bit more of that data to align it throughout the rest of the IEP. So in this case, we have Alex, who struggles to verbally communicate with peers. Peers have a difficult time understanding what she is trying to communicate on 4 out of 10 exchanges. So that statement there is really just to put in and show you this is one way of documenting data, is to show exchanges or trials or opportunities. So we can do it, but it has to be with a number. When we talk about baseline data, we have to use numbers when we're doing that. So to continue, when she does attempt conversation with adults, it is typically related to her culture and logos and brands from her country. Alex has difficulty having conversations about topics with peers or teachers other than her favorite topics. So again, here's a statement that doesn't necessarily have data in the sense of numbers, but it is data in a sense that it describes where some of these struggles are and difficulties this child has. So we are able in our present levels to give descriptions as well as putting in data. And I'll continue and I'll explain a little bit more about what data must be in there. So we have here that she will not initiate a conversation at all with her peers. Now, that is a statement that says not at all, which means 0%. So we are able to use statements like cannot do it all, or can do it 100%, or does it all the time, which would mean 100%. So we can use trials, exchanges, and we can use percentages. Alex gets along with all of her peers and adults in the classroom. She responds to greetings from peers, but does not initiate them. Once in a conversation, Alex will continue to talk about her likes and will talk over individuals. Now, I've highlighted that because that statement is going to relate later on to some of the needs and then possibly down into the supplemental area. She does not openly participate in group work. Alex will try to work on her own instead of working with her partners. She takes longer to formulate ideas and struggles to complete, that should say, her writing when more than 2 paragraphs are requested. Alex needs additional time to complete tasks or answer written questions. Alex has made progress in terms of advocating for herself when she needs help on a task, an academic task. And she will raise her hand to get the teacher's attention by saying their name 2 out of 4 times. So again, here's a little bit more data. And then the very last sentence here where it says Alex is presenting with 60% success in her pragmatic language skills for appropriate use of conversational skills overall. That's going to be key because that is going to attach directly to the goal in which, in this case, our speech therapist would work on. The blue piece here I want to add is just some descriptors of other statements that are going to relate to needs and, again, supplementals later on. It says Alex is highly distractible and goes off task frequently. She responds well when redirected by the teacher with nonverbal and subtle verbal cueing, asking her a question about a task. When multiple directions are given, Alex will become confused and need checks for understanding. She does better answering questions out loud when she is given a heads up that the teacher will be calling on her. And when Alex is provided with extra time to answer questions out loud, she is more likely to comply. So these are all statements that are not necessarily data, but they are very important and will relate later on in the IEP. Next slide, please. So the state looks at our present levels of performance. They look to see whether or not we have data in there. They definitely look at the goal to see if that goal matches the data. But the other thing that they do is they jump down right underneath that present levels and they look to see, have we given statements of need that relate to the descriptions that were put up above in the present levels. And so what I did was I just took out some of those snippets, I highlighted them and I put them in here, but they don't have to be full descriptions with the data. They don't have to be full explanations, but they have to at least address where the student was struggling and some of the things we said above. So in this case, the academic needs are that Alex needs to continue to work on basic conversational speech. We'll need to continue developing strategies to create relationships with peers. We'll need additional time to complete tasks or to respond to verbal questions. And that was definitely up above. Checks for understanding after directions are given. And then we also put into this section any concerns of the parent. And in this case, we put the parent voice in to say the parent is pleased with the progress in reading, but is still concerned about her ability to hold a conversation with others. So that goes right along with what we're talking about for this young lady. And then in the management needs, this is where we're talking about some of the degree or the extent in which environmental or human materials, materials are needed, resources that are needed. And in this case, we put that she needs verbal and nonverbal redirecting from the teacher when off task. And then that she also needs adults to check on her understanding of the task. So when we get down later on, we'll take a look at these supplementals and we'll be able to see how they relate. Next slide, please. So just for alignment purposes, I wanted to align the present levels to the needs and the goals. So I added here, what were some of those academic pieces that we needed? And under her reading, that should say under her speech, Alex is presenting with 60% success in her pragmatic language skills for appropriate use of conversational skills overall. This goes directly with the goal that is below. And the goal says, given a social situation, Alex will use a learned strategy to follow conversational rules. And in parentheses, it gives examples, things like initiating the conversation, request or responding to clarification, allow and maintain a pause in order to express herself. So this is the speech goal. It relates directly up to what we were talking about in her present levels. And there is the data that says she can do this 60% of the time right now. And then the needs that relate to that are, again, needs to continue to work on basic conversation. These all relate right to the goal, continuing to develop strategies to create relationships, etc. Okay, next, please. So this slide really is showing the alignment of the present levels to the supplemental aids. And all I did for just this purpose, when you look back on it, is I just snipped all of the areas in the present levels and the needs that relate down to these to show evidence, basically, of what we're writing in this supplemental area. And one of the first things that the state does is they take a look at, are we putting the same information in each one of the columns all the time? So if you look at location, does the location, which is on the far right here, do they all say the same thing? And if they all were to say across all academic settings, and then the service doesn't match an academic piece or an academic setting, it kind of throws a red flag to them to keep looking a little bit deeper on this. So we have to make these very specific for the location, the duration, and then the frequency. And so we use in our frequency most of the time, we use the service delivery recommendation. And then we have to describe what it is that we're how we are implementing this service modification. So for this first one, extended time to complete tasks. When you look up into the present levels, you'll see that, that Alex needs to have some extra time to answer some questions. She needs to get some maybe prep time beforehand. She needs additional time to complete tasks, especially written ones. And so this question, this area basically says, how are we implementing this extended time? Now you'll notice just in this example, it also said when working with word problems in math that we were given some extended time. That's because under the math PLEP, there was some information there. And again, under writing, there was some information. So in this case, we're going with she needs extended time writing assignments in her core classes of more than 2 paragraphs. She requires additional time, 1.5%. 1.5 times the amount for other students. So that would relate up to when you go up above that she needs some additional time. And in one of the other PLEPs that we had the 2 paragraphs written there. Excuse me. So for refocusing, again, we're looking at across all academic settings throughout the day, and then we're given an explanation of how we're going to implement that refocusing and redirecting. And for this student, we're saying the teacher is to use verbal and nonverbal cues when the student is off task. And we would ask a question of the student for her if she needs clarification. So we're telling a how and not the why. The why is what we've described up above in the present levels and in the needs. And then again, I move down to just looking at checks for understanding. And again, we have like after each step, the teacher will check for understanding by asking questions. For directions, Alex will restate the directions to the teacher when asked. These are things that are needed and very specific as to how we are going to do those checks for understandings. And then the additional wait time is the very last one I have down there, is that Alex needs additional time to process information. That goes right up above where we said needs additional time to complete tasks. And then we give wait time. We build right in there. We're saying give 20 seconds wait time. And then the teacher should also prepare the student in advance when they're going to call on her for questions. So we mentioned that up in the PLEPs up above that she does better if she is prepared and questions are given to her ahead of time by the teacher. So we build that in. Now, one of the things that I want to mention about this section is good teaching strategies don't all have to be listed here. We know that teachers are really good about when they give directions, repeating the directions. We know that teachers redirect students and they clarify, and we know that they give extra time for students. The important piece is when a student needs it above and beyond what you would typically do as part of your tier 1 or your typical good teaching strategies, that's when you need to add it into this section, and you need to have some information that really supports that. Because the state looks at this and then they go up to the present levels and they look to see if they match and they align. Okay, next slide. So one of the other areas that the state asked us to look at was the effect of the students' need on their involvement and their progress in the general ed curriculum. And they were very specific about this for us. They were not looking for us to give a broad statement of, the students' disability of speech impacts them across all settings. They're not looking for that. They're not looking for the child's OHI impacts their ability to function in the school. They're not looking for that general, that basic of a statement. They are looking for us to state, how does the child's disability impact their involvement and progress in the gen ed curriculum? And so I just used this statement for a student. This is a typical student that would be, let's just say somebody that is OHI, has the ADHD, and this their disability manifests itself through inattentiveness, high distractibility, and hyperactivity. It's very typical for a student that has ADHD to have those deficits or impacts. But the key piece in this statement would be these issues affect the child's ability to focus in class, complete writing assignments, and answer questions out loud or follow multiple steps. This is what is the impact in the gen ed class. And so that are examples of how the disability is impacting them. And then we need to have a statement that is really focused to these behaviors have a negative impact on his involvement and progress in the general ed curriculum. Again, they're not looking for a statement across all settings, even though we know the disability impacts them across wherever they go. This statement is just specifically for the gen ed curriculum.
Gina,
Okay.
that makes sense when you think about it. The state is looking for us to really have our students be as close to general education as possible. And that's really what least restrictive environment and LRE decisions are all about. So taking that into consideration, our desired location for all students is gen ed to the most extent possible. So it makes sense that, you know, the feedback that we've received here is really how can we always be considering that in all the decisions that we make at the CSE table.
Correct. And even in the special classes, we are to be giving the gen ed curriculum. That's what's to be taught. Now, there's different ways to do that, but you're right. Everybody, unless they are in a NYSED setting, they should be getting the gen ed curriculum. So what does this look like for the next steps with CEQA? All right. So where are we moving on to next? One of the areas that they're doing right now is CEQA is in our buildings and working with our central office CSE chairs and other chairs in the buildings, looking at our initial process and our reevaluations. And basically what they're doing with that evaluation process is they're looking to see how are we determining what evaluations students need. So every 3 years we do the overall comprehensive. For initials, we have to determine which evaluations are needed. And so you've all gotten that referral form. I'm sure you've seen it and you've had to go through it and maybe put some information on it. Possibly you've filled one out. But there is a section in there which is the determination of the needed evaluations. And that part, we have to bring in parent involvement into the conversation. We need to log and track what is it the parent is saying and what is their understanding around their child's deficits and what evaluations might they want or need based on those deficits. So we have to have that conversation involving the parent. We have to look at data collection prior to the child being referred. So we're going to look at our RTI, we're going to look at our intervention strategies and any data that we may have on the student in order to say, hey, these are some areas of deficits. Maybe this is the type of evaluation we need. So we have to log that, list that, and we have to, as a committee, make the determination of what are the evaluations needed. And then they're looking to see at the CSE meeting whether or not we are actually discussing each and every one of the evaluations. And is that discussion in layman's terms? Can we understand it? Is it a bunch of our jargon that we understand as educators, or is it so that the parent can understand what's happening as well? So that has to be very clear, and that's what they're looking at. And so we're entering into the stage of where the CEQA will be doing another review, and the review is on the evaluation process. So now I'm just going to give you where I think we're going and where I think we need to continue to focus on. And I'm going to end with just one piece talking about the progress monitoring. This is very key, and this is key to our data collection, especially for staff next year that end up picking up a student since we do year-round IEPs. We need to make sure that our data statements are in the comments for every one of our progress monitoring. So for every goal, we need to make sure there is a comment and that there is data that goes to where the student currently is at that goal. We have to make sure that it's aligned to the goal. We can't just put in data that says, the student has made no progress and there's no data where they are. We have to really kind of make some clarifying statements there to show that it's measurable, that we've observed the task. One of the pieces on this that you'll see is that the lack of attendance has been a question that people are asking me. What do we do when the student is not attending school? How do we document that for progress in the notes. And the way we document it is, one, we can state in our present levels that, the student has not attended school 30 out of 40 days. That's data. That's data that goes in there. And then we would, for a student that we don't have any data on, that maybe hasn't attended at all, we would use the last means of data that we had. Maybe it was last year's teacher. Maybe it was in the beginning of the year. We had some slight data that said the child was only doing 40% towards this 80% goal. We used the last data that we had. And that may even be data from an initial or the last evaluation we did. So we still need to make sure we make the statement. We still need to make sure that we put some data in there. And we also need to make sure that we are documenting for attendance, that we have a good trail of documentation. We can't just say, hey, I contacted the parent in September and now it's March and the kid hasn't been here. The student hasn't been here the whole time. We really need to continue to do that. So those are areas, because I have heard the state even ask us, well, you have documentation in your process of the student not attending, correct? And then I have to go into the contact log and I have to look and see what data is there. So these are the areas that came out of our corrective action plan that we're focusing on, the directions that we're heading. And I think what you're going to be in for today with Shannon and Amy is that they're going to really delve into how you can pull information into each of these areas. So with that, I'll turn it back to Shannon. And Shannon, thank you.
Thanks, Jean. So I know that was a lot of information. And what we hope to do during the next several slides of this presentation is unpack it and go a little bit deeper into those recommendations and that feedback from CEQA. And we just are so excited to have related service providers here today and really be able to speak really relevantly to you. We've heard in a lot of our previous professional learnings, the feedback from you that you would like a session that's really, specific to the needs of the related service provider. So I hope that you find this very informative. So we want to start with unpacking some of the recommendations and things that we know we are still noticing as we go through the CSE process, based on some of our previous data-driven professional learnings. So this graphic here shows all of the components that I know all of us know are important in developing that data-based IEP. But I want to draw special attention to number 4, our related service component, and highlight the fact that the related service providers, whether you're speech, OT, PT, audiology, the match team, any one of these different related service providers or teams, your information that you have around what that student is receiving and why they are receiving that service should really be weaved through all of the different components of the student's IEP. It should not just solely live in the speech and language section or the physical development section if you're OT or PT. We really have to consider those pieces as we look at the entire IEP. And I think that that's been some of the questions that have come from a lot of the CSE meetings that I chair. If you're a social worker, don't just put your stuff in the social section. You can look at the other areas. And Jean, I think you could also share too that the feedback from New York State is that they want to see that across all the different areas because it's not being provided in isolation.
That is correct. They do want to see that. And they've actually, they mentioned to me when they were doing this review that they were not even happy with where we break it out and we say speech, we say OT, we say PT, we say, and the response to them was, is it still compliant though, the way we're doing it? And so it is compliant, but they do want to see some of that conversation back and forth, because what they noticed, as Shannon is saying, is they started seeing discrepancies between what one provider and a teacher were saying about the skill level of a student. And then when they see that, they definitely say, we're not talking, we're not communicating. And if I could, just one little piece, and I know you're going to jump on this that I forgot to mention, is under the goals that it's at least on this slide. The other piece that they were really focusing on with our related service goals, but even our academic goals, was that they did not want to see multi-skills in one goal. They did not want to see us saying the student was going to identify, analyze, process, information. They want to see very specific and pretty clear-cut measurable goals, which you can't really measure an analysis unless you tell me exactly what the student's doing. And so they were real specific about that. And I know that I've already met with the social workers, and we kind of went through some things in there, and I've seen some real good changes already. So hopefully we can continue to move in that direction. I know you're going to touch on that later.
Yeah, no, thanks, Gene. Very relevant point. So I just, communication is key, and I know sometimes that can be challenging, but as you're preparing your IEPs, make sure that you're really doing that alignment check, right? So going backwards through that IEP, checking, if you are an OT or a PT, looking at that special transportation. Is any of your work impacting the need for that special transportation? Testing accommodations, speech and language pathologists, that's an area where you may need to think about how you're writing your present levels of performance to make sure it aligns with those testing accommodations that are justifying that directions repeated, directions read, because that aligns with some of the work you do. I'm not saying that it's just you. It should be in collaboration with the teachers. I think that it's insightful to think about looking at the entire IEP as you're working on it, in how you provide your services and what that service looks like for that whole child perspective. So I think that one thing I love about related service providers, all of you, is that the data piece. I think everybody does a really, really nice job at citing the quantitative data points and the qualitative data points. But I just wanted to reiterate that for each and every one of our IEP goals that we are going to reference on that IEP, there should be some baseline data. And as you're developing those present levels of performance, you are also probably reporting out on how they're doing on that current goal as you anticipate the progression to that next goal. So really being, diligent about making sure you have those data points. And I think the area where we as CSE chair people see a struggle with coming up with data is in the social work and the counseling area. So thinking about those sessions, thinking about the data that you take to report out on your related services log for each one of your sessions, really thinking about how you can use that data to support developing the plan. Along with the quantitative data points, there's also that qualitative data. And I think that this is the nice place where everyone here can add in some information into the present levels of performance across the reading, the writing, the math, those sections of the IEP, because you may not have data around how a student's progressing in reading comprehension, but through your therapy sessions that the student struggles in the area of reading because of self-confidence. So as a social worker, you may want to look at that reading section and make sure that that's really highlighted in there, because that just, weaves in the work that you do with that child in that small group counseling session around self-confidence and advocating for their needs as it relates to that worry and that struggle in the area of reading comprehension. So there's two ways that you can come up with your goals, right? You can begin with the data that you already have through the assessments that maybe it's a previous IEP goal that's grounding your work moving forward, or you can start with what that student needs to do and create a baseline assessment. And I think everyone that is on this presentation today does a really nice job at collecting data, as I said before, but thinking a little bit more outside the box as it relates to collecting data to inform an IEP goal that's really measurable. So we want to say that it's okay to come up with your own baseline assessment in order to do this. It should be something that's teacher created or related service provider created. And I'm thinking, for example, a social worker working on a counseling goal, maybe you are giving a hypothetical situation and taking a structured interview around whether or not that student has the skills to deal with that peer conflict. That's data that can be used to inform the baseline data for your IEP goal. So this is an example, and this is an example that is an academic-based example around collecting qualitative data and quantitative data. I think for this and for the purpose of this audience today, I just want to draw attention to Alexis is unable to read grade level text independently. Therefore, all grade level text is read out loud to her. That qualitative data point justifies testing accommodations of possibly test read. She is unable to read grade level text. So we know that if she's taking an assessment, it is going to be challenging, if not impossible, for her to answer questions about that text unless it is read out loud. So that qualitative data point paired with the quantitative data point around CVC words and that struggle make for a goal that aligns with when presented with 10 words containing a mix of CVC and CVC and CVCE patterns, Alexis will decode and read the words with 80% accuracy. So as a related service provider, having some additional qualitative data points to really highlight the quantitative data point that the teacher may have can be especially helpful in giving us a really strong present level of performance that really provide for a strong foundation for that IEP goal. I also noted in here, the statement at the bottom here that says she prefers to work in small group. That may be something that was noted from a social worker because of, in a small group counseling session that student struggles. And she shared in that counseling session that she struggles with, answering questions in front of a larger audience. She doesn't like independent work, so she prefers to work in small group. So I just want everyone to feel comfortable with adding additional information to the present levels of performance that really help to highlight that child's needs and to think really about the qualitative data points. You guys are, like I said, so strong with that quantitative data point, but to add in some of those qualitative points that you may have uncovered in therapy sessions or in your related services. So as you look to determine whether or not your IEP is ready for CSE, it has everything that it needs, you and the teacher, and we're not asking just you to ever do this alone, everyone should be doing this. Do I have baseline data statements in the present level of performance that matches what the student can currently do in regards to each goal? So just doing that spot check. Yes, I have something in my physical development session that says where the student is at and in regards to planning for my occupational therapy goal. Does my criteria match the goal? Example, the goal says students will answer 5 questions, but the criteria is 85%. 4 out of 5 is actually 80%. So thinking about that criteria, right? Does it make sense for what I want them to do? Does the present level of performance tell me what the student can currently do overall, as well as what they can do in regards to the stated goals? Does it include how they gain access to grade level curriculum despite their disability? Right? There might be something that you can contribute to that area of the IEP, which really supports how does that help the student gain access to that grade level curriculum? And then does the present level of performance determine what the students needs to achieve at the current level and why? So for example, a graphic organizer for writing to accommodate sequencing and organizational deficits. Maybe it's having opportunities for movement and breaks because we know that the student engages better on a task if they have that opportunity every 10 minutes to get up, take a stretch break, sit back down, and then continue on with the assignment. I think there's lots of places where, or lots of different things that we automatically are doing for students that we know, but I think we just have to, really make sure that they're really explicit to that student and it is identified in the present level of performance. So I just want to remind everyone, Amy did send out an email this morning, which highlights the presentation, it has all the links and everything from today's session. The parking lot is available there for everyone to send in questions and that we will follow up with after this professional learning with the responses to those. So we're going to move into the next section of our professional learning today. And this is really going to unpack some new stuff, but hopefully not entirely new. I hope that you've been hearing a lot of this information at your CSE meetings from your CSE chair people, as we also are deepening our understanding based on what the feedback is from CEQA. So as I know everyone here is aware, IDEA says that supplementary aids and services means that the aids, services, and other supports that are provided in regular education classes and other educational related settings and in extracurricular and non-academic settings are provided to enable children with disabilities to be educated with non-disabled children to the maximum extent appropriate. So part of our role as related service providers is really understanding that specially designed instruction that we know works best for our students, and helping our teachers in the classroom setting understand how to implement those effectively to support students. So this is a refresher from an earlier training where we really deepened our understanding around SDI. So supplementary aids and services are really there to support, right? Those are the aids and services and other supports that we use to make sure that students with disabilities can be educated with non-disabled students to the maximum extent possible in that LRA. That is our goal. We want students to be with their general education peers. So using supplementary aids and services is the way that we support that. It's how we level that playing field. Accommodations is what we use to adjust that environment and adjust the instruction or the materials, allowing students with disability equal access to learning and demonstrating what they have learned according to that general education curriculum. So thinking about those accommodations, and we're going to go through some examples on our next slide, thinking about those accommodations that really allow them to demonstrate their learning. And lastly, program modifications. These are the things that we do to really change the outcome, change what they're going to do. And as Jean highlighted earlier, really the only programs that we use program accommodations for, like modified curriculum, are in our NYSED program, because we're changing that outcome. We're changing what we're expecting them to do, and we're adjusting that standard. So some examples: supplementary aids and services. So a note taker, additional transition time. This term is often used interchangeably with accommodations. So having a note taker, having additional transition time could also be a supplementary aid, but it could also be an accommodation. Having additional time to complete writing tasks, because we know that it's definitely more challenging for them. So giving them more time to do it, maybe we're going to give them access to a word processor to do that. So we know that they need a little bit more time to do that. Fewer items on a page, copy of steps to solve a multi-step word problem. Having access to those materials helps them to ultimately demonstrate their learning more successfully. And then some examples of program modifications, reducing the number of standards. So rather than teaching them, a multi-step word problems, I'm going to use that as an example, teaching them and having them follow all of the different operations, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. It's really a modification if you're only asking them to add and subtract, if the standard says they must be able to do all of those components. Alternate assessment, NYSA, and then also altering the curriculum and or the grading system, choosing to grade students differently, which is different for a general education student, is a program modification. I'm going to pause and I'm going to turn over the next slide to Shannon D'Agostino.
Sorry, I was muted talking to myself. So when we sometimes, related service providers get pulled into those MTSS meetings, right? And you are asked to give some insight on a student who we are possibly considering for special education. I just want to really make sure that we clarify some of these terms in general so that everyone's on the same page. And as we're listening to things that we've been speaking to as far as accommodations, a lot of times accommodations and interventions can be very similar. So something like small group instruction, extra practice, those are things that we can see on a student's IEP. The difference is that interventions are for all students, including those with disabilities, are eligible for these temporary targeted skill-based strategies or lessons to remediate a deficit. Interventions do not specifically address the barriers of a disability. So that is something that's available for all students. When we consider those accommodations, something that is available to some students, the students who fall into that some category are the students with disabilities. So when we are providing accommodations on an IEP, it can be in addition to interventions. The interventions provide us some of that data that we may need, but the accommodations are disability based, and that is why we have them on the IEP. So these are not things that all students get automatically. It is for a student with a disability. And then going back to what Shannon was just sharing, as far as those modifications, when we consider all of our students with disabilities receiving accommodations, those modifications are an even smaller group of those students. Those are just a few students who have those actual changes. With regards to that curriculum measurement of learning, we've really changed that rigor of the expectation. So just to make sure that, everyone's all on the same page as far as these three terms go, because we do sometimes use them interchangeably, especially at the accommodation intervention level. So the specially designed instruction piece, connecting that to those supplementary aid supports, accommodations, and modifications. I look at some of the PLEPs that are written by the related service providers, and there's so much quality information in there. I think I think this is something that you just do naturally, where you're really explaining exactly what is needed, not just for the student, but what the teacher or provider needs to do. So, providing that explicit outline. One thing, when we consider, calming strategies or self-regulation or coping skills, those are often something that we see as a student needing, and the teacher might say that, the social worker may say that, but we want to make sure that we're talking about teaching and practicing those strategies. So we're not just going to hand students something, we're going to teach them and show them how to use it. If we are giving them, some sort of communication device, that we also have in the PLEP that they are going to receive explicit instruction on how to use that device. And so our PLEP is where we're really going to outline what the teacher and related service providers are going to do. And when it's there in the PLEP, everyone sees it, everyone knows that that's the expectation because it's been outlined, right? You service students for X number of minutes a week, right? So we need to make sure that all of the classroom staff is then following through on your recommendations and what you need to see to provide that really, that wraparound care of system for our kids. Prompts to slow their rate for speech. Your only speech is only with the students X number of hours a week. That's really a responsibility of all staff to make sure that they are providing those prompts. And I really want to emphasize that this section, the supplementary aid services program modification accommodation section, is not off limits to our related service providers. When I go through the IEPs, oftentimes there's so many things that I'm like, oh my gosh, we really need to spell this out. The student needs access to their communication device at this time. This is what it looks like. They need to be able to take it home, those kinds of things. So we can really, you guys can utilize this section as well. The management needs in the supplementary aids and services accommodation program modification section, those two can get a little muddy sometimes, and it can be unclear as to what's a management need and what goes down in this other section. So I want to make sure that, we really understand that the management needs are what the student needs in order to learn in the least restrictive environment and when they need it. So yes, that's academic needs, but that relates to all of those related service pieces as well. So as you are outlining your PLEP, oftentimes you've put a lot of management needs in there. There are environmental needs, human needs, material resources that need to be included in this section. I have to say, related service providers do a very nice job of defining it in the present levels. And not just that academic level, right? You're defining it in your social PLEPs, your physical PLEPs. So it's defined there. We want to make sure that you guys are then listing it under this management needs section. And we can include the components of the program that the student needs or uses. So you might think, well, when the kid comes to counseling, when the kid comes to speech, if we're doing this related service, we automatically do those things. Not everybody knows that. If there's a component to speech that you use for that particular student and they need it and they use it, we want to list it under that management needs section. When we're deciding what to put in the supplementary aids and services section, those are specific things for that individual student that needs to be very specific as to how, when, and where. So if the student needs additional transition time because of a mobility issue, and they need to have additional time to transition in a school building, that is something very specific for that student that we want to talk about how they need that X number of minutes. They need an additional 3 minutes. They need access to the elevator, right? We want to make sure that we're really defining that in this section. You've told us the why in the present levels. This is where we're going to talk about how that's delivered. Anything that's considered as needed, you're not going to really include that in this section. So for social workers, the student needs access to a cool down area. And it's something that when the student feels frustrated, they are going to determine when they need to go to the cool down corner. You can put that in the management needs, that they need access when frustrated. Student needs access to a calming area, but you don't have to include that in the supplementary aids and service section because it's kind of when the student is determining it. Now, if you have a student that needs, access when the student is frustrated, they need access to a calming area within the classroom, and they're going to use a break pass. They are not going to, just go over there. They have a system where they're going to provide you a pass that's a little more specific for that individual student. And again, what you do in your sessions for all of the students, you may not need to include, and you're not going to include in this section, right? Because you kind of provide it for everyone benefits from it, but we want to outline really specific things in this section. Thank you. So how do you know, right? How are we going to determine what should be listed in this section? Consider your access. What does the student need to access the general education curriculum from the present levels? You've put it in your present levels. It's all listed there. Have I listed it in the management needs section? Now you've taken those needs and you've put it in the management needs section. You've considered any environmental accommodations that they need. You've listed any human or material resources. It's all there. Now, once you look at that list, is there anything that needs more specificity? Is it beyond as needed? And if it is, that's when you would add it to that supplementary aids service program modification accommodation section. And we're going to make sure that it's really defined. And kind of to couple that, if you look down at that supplementary aids service program modification accommodation section and you see something in there that aligns to the related service that you provide, and you know that that's no longer applicable for this student, you can remove that prior to the meeting if you know that that's no longer something that they need or use. So more defined example, our management needs listed. We've got some preferential seating, structured environment, visual models, transitions, all of those things that we often see. When we decide that it's going to go over to that supplementary aid support program modification accommodation section, that's where we're really going to define that how. And the frequency will be to see delivery recommendation. We're not putting as needed. We're putting a very specific recommendation. So for preferential seating, Preston requires a seat where there are no peers behind him to reduce anxiety and increase focus. So if you're a social worker and you've put into the PLEP that the student can present as anxious, the student, is inattentive at times, and the student has more success when there are no peers seated behind them, that's a management need, because we are adjusting the environment for this student to make sure that they are in a seat where there's no peers behind him. But when we list it as management needs, it just says preferential seating. So we really want to define that. Oftentimes when we see preferential seating listed and it's not specified, we just assume that the student is going to be close to the instructor or up close in the classroom. And in this case, that's not what the student needs. Same with that support for transitions. So ASD consult comes in and they really know that this student needs that support with transition. We're going to define that. We're going to define what that looks like for this student. So they're going to get a 3-minute prompt followed by a 1-minute prompt prior to transitions in and out of the classroom. So our classroom staff is going to provide that 3-minute prompt and the 1-minute prompt, but so is the PE teacher. So is the music teacher. So, they also go to speech. So is the speech teacher. We're going to incorporate that transition in every aspect of the student's day. To kind of visualize how this will play out is our present levels of performance. We're including the needs as well as the why they are the needs, right? And then we're going to restate them in the management section. We restate the needs, that what piece from the present levels, and define the when. If it needs more specificity, we will then drop it down to that supplementary aid support program modification accommodation. We're only restating their needs that are so individualized, they need that explicit explanation. Considering alignment, everything should be in that present level. Your present level tiers down to your management needs. What is in your supplementary aid support program modification accommodation section does not have to match the management needs. They don't have to match. You can have 12 management needs and 4 supplementary aid supports program modification accommodations. That's okay. However, anything that is in that section should also then be in the management needs, and that again aligning up at the present levels of performance. And again, it goes back to the way beginning slides that Shannon showed with that wheel, and really making sure that every component of this IEP is aligned, and that we have aligned our understanding of what this student needs, that there's not conflicting statements, and that we've represented all of those pieces in the present levels. Another way to think about this, is we consider those best practices. And, anyone who is in special education, whether it's a special education administrator, teacher, related service provider, there's just things that we do that are best practices. And we don't always do a good job of teasing that out when we're doing an IEP, because it's just second nature to us. So we know that we have those best practices that are good for all kids, but we want to take those and then really define that specially designed instruction. What does this individual student need from us as the educators, providers, personnel assigned to the student? What do they need from us to access all of these components? So when we consider technology, that assistive technology, the modifications, testing accommodations, support for school personnel, how does that look in our present levels? So testing accommodations is just another component of the IEP that we need to consider for alignment to the PLEPs. Testing accommodations are changes to the format of the test or its administration procedures. The testing accommodations change how the students tested, but they do not change what the test measures. And students with disabilities that receive these testing accommodations, they're still required to take the same assessment, right? They have to take the exact same test and reach the same level of proficiency as their non-disabled peers. The testing accommodations are what's going to allow them that access. And I think that this is a section that we often overlook for our related service providers, because there are definitely key components in this section that I think, you certainly have the inside knowledge to really bring some information to how we can best provide these for our students. So when we consider those testing accommodations, what does the student need to access this assessment, right? What do they need? And then can we define what this looks like? So if we know, the classroom teacher has put in the academic section that the student has, difficulty attending to task, remaining focused, and they need prompts. The social worker has reiterated that, that they need some breaks to eliminate them getting frustrated and escalated. Well, then maybe we can define that and consider that for our testing accommodations, that they may also need a break here. Is it disability based? Is this something that the student needs based on their disability? And then is there evidence of these needs in the present levels? So if we are saying that the student needs text to speech, no. Speech to text, it would probably be. If they need that accommodation for a test, we want to make sure that that's in the PLEP and the management needs as well, that that's something that this student needs. Test read, if the student needs that on a testing accommodation, we can't see that need for the first time at this point in the IEP. It should also be up in the PLEPs. So really making sure that we are aligning those needs. Scribes, specialized paper, all of that is outlined in the PLEPs. So if you know that the student needs something, we can definitely add that to the testing accommodations, and you can help define what that's going to look like for the student. Special transportation falls into this category as well. This is another section where we really shouldn't see anything new. So transportation for a student with disability to and from school whose disability prevents them from using the same transportation as their non-disabled peers. Most students with disability can and should receive the same transportation provided to non-disabled peers, because this too is aligned with that LRE requirement. So when we're considering special transportation, we really want to consider how it relates to that disability and that it's reflected in the PLEPs. So there should not be something down here that hasn't been described in the PLEPs. And I understand that oftentimes that outside of an initial, that special transportation is already listed. So, feel free to go down and take a look at it and say, this is something that the student absolutely needs. I see that no one else has put this in the PLEP, but I know that this kind of relates to what service I provide. So I'm going to add it to my PLEP. So for example, adult supervision is something that, is listed for this student in the social present level due to Cash's impulsivity and need to escape situations as evidenced on his FBA. Cash requires adult supervision during transitions in and out of the school. We're going to include a natural statement relating to what the student needs in regards to that special transportation. And I think this slide really speaks to the work that most of you do, right? Mobility needs, behavioral needs, communication needs, developmental needs, physical needs, medical needs, right? So these are all disability related, and we need to make sure that we're describing it in those present levels so that it matches the student needs and it's aligning throughout the IEP.
Shannon, can I just jump in on this slide very quickly? I just wanted to kind of add to what you're saying. When you're thinking about how the classification and the educational disability relates to special transportation, it really must be what is stopping the child from being able to access the same transportation as all other students. I think this is an area where our districts sometimes can become overly restrictive with adding transportation. What part of that disability would stop the child from being able to access the same transportation as other students is something that we should always be thinking and reflecting on as we're considering that section.
And we want to make sure that special transportation is aligning to that disability. It's not appropriate for non-disability based reasons. You know, the neighborhood's unsafe. You know, my schedule, the parent schedule doesn't align to the busing. You know, we don't have a car and we can't get the kid to the bus stop, accommodating the student schedule for sports or work, bad weather. It's hard. It can be very hard to make that decision and to really support a decision like that, because we want our kids in school, right? At the end of the day, we want our kids here, but we really have to make sure that it's aligned to the disability, because again, this is another area that the state's really taking a look at and saying, you know, this does not match the disability. And if you feel really strongly that it does match the disability, we need to make sure that it's outlined in the PLEPs. And then assessing that effectiveness. So when we have a draft open, it's an opportunity for us to really take a look at what is there and say if this does or does not work anymore for this student. So, you know, I think it's really important that, you know, you go through and say, okay, so this student previously had these things listed. I'm going to take a look and see if that makes sense. So did the student use that accommodation consistently? Did the accommodation allow that student to access or demonstrate learning as well as their peers? Did it allow the student to feel like a member of the class? Did the student like using it, right? So you have a student who has a communication device and they don't want to use it. They refuse to use it. They're not interested in using it. You've tried everything. Then maybe we need to take that off and look for an alternative. The student has weighted vest. They don't want to use it. They hate it. They refuse to put it on. What else can we do? Let's take that off and find a replacement that's going to provide the student the similar input that they're looking for. And then to consider that progress. Does this accommodation support their growth and or progress? And we know that our students mature. We know that their environments can change as they go from maybe elementary school to middle school or high school. You know, from one classroom, maybe they're going to go from a 6 to a 12. So all of these things, as they change each year, you know, this is our opportunity to really look again at that individual student and their needs and remove things that are no longer effective. So the present levels of performance for the related service provider, these are just a few pieces that have come through, you know, through CSE meetings, through AD meetings, through the state, just some reminders, again, reducing that jargon, right? You guys are experts in your field. You certainly use, you know, testing and, you know, accommodations and have some words that maybe teachers or parents don't understand. And when it's explained in a way that everyone understands it, I think it's more likely to get done and followed through on. Reminder 2, when using acronyms in the PLEPs, we want to write it out at least once, and then you can continue to use it. Another reminder, even if a teacher has written in one area of the PLEP, you should also add to this area if it's relevant. Oftentimes I'll see, you know, the psych will put in, you know, under all of the academic categories, and then they'll do an overall cognitive, and then, you know, the teacher will add to that, or the speech will add their section up in that academic part. I think one of the places that it tends to miss out on is that social PLEP. So the teacher can certainly talk about what that looks like in the classroom, right? How does the student interact with their peers? How do they follow rules? How do they interact with adults? Do they advocate for themselves? What does that look like in the classroom? But if you are also seeing that student is a social worker, we want to make sure that we're communicating what that looks like for you as well, because you may have inside information, you know, or strategies that are working for you, and then in the counseling. And we want to make sure that everything's aligned. So just making sure that, you know, everyone is contributing to all areas of the PLEP. And then the last reminder is taking the needs and supports that you've outlined in the PLEP and including those in that management needs section. What's listed there has to be done, right? So we really want to ensure that if you've taken the time to write that PLEP and to do those evaluations, and you're working on that in your sessions, we want to make sure that it's followed through on in listing it in that management needs. And then our goals. So those goals, again, to kind of remind, going back to what Jean said, one skill per goal, and that skill needs to be observable and measurable. So making sure that, we're really looking at what we need to see the student do. Each goal should have a data statement in the present level connecting to that goal. And then when we consider the schedule, you want to think about how often you're going to formally collect and assess that data. So if you see the student twice a week, you're going to collect data each week, every session, you're making your notes and you're collecting some data, but you really, maybe it's every 2 weeks on your schedule that you're going to go through, look at that data and see what adjustments you need to make in order to continue that student's growth or in order to get them to show some growth. The other thing I think about too is that criteria. Sometimes with related services, it might be more about on an occasion or in a, there's an X number of occasions that have to happen for the student to be able to do this because it's more natural. So if we're looking for maybe the student to, walk up and down the stairs without, stopping with 2 feet on each step, we're going to look at that on X number of occasions for the student to do that. And when we look at that criteria period, how many times does the student need to do that successfully for you to say that they've met the goal? And then we have some resources listed. They are more aligned to those accommodations, program modifications, and supplementary aids. And they're listed 2 different ways. So the first, they might be a little bit repetitive, but they're broken down. Some are based on, speech related type items, OT related items, communication pieces. So they're broken down by type. To help you kind of, maybe you're struggling for what you could use for the student. So you can look at those for some inspiration. And it will also, kind of aligns that specially designed instruction, right? So that the student needs this, but here's what you can be doing. What we can put is that SDI outlined in the PLEP so that we've defined really why the student needs it and what it looks like to then be followed through on. And of course, we included the New York State annotated IEP. So if anyone has any questions about what goes in any individual section, it is outlined for us there.
All right. Thank you, Shannon D, for your for walking us through all of that. Amy, did you want to say anything as we conclude today? I know you want to talk about the survey.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you everyone for attending. I really appreciate you as a captive audience as we unpacked the content of today's presentation. As I shared in the beginning of the presentation, it is required that you go back to the Office of Professional Learning Superintendent's Conference Day page and click on that link to complete a survey. That survey link will document your attendance of today's session so that we can verify that you've been here, that you receive credit. In addition to that, it is credit for state certification because it is during the daytime that we are watching this presentation, but that is where you'll get your credit for that. If you have any follow-up questions after this presentation, please make sure you enter a question into that form in the parking lot link that we sent you. Also, you can enter multiple questions and we will make sure that we're looking at those and answering them specifically, as we know that sometimes the questions that you have during IEP development are very specific to that student or that IEP in general. So just wanted to give you another invitation to give us a question in that contact parking lot log that we sent you. So I think that is all we have for today. We are letting you go a few minutes early so that you can continue on with the rest of the activities that you have, or maybe this is the end of your day, depending on your schedule. So thank you again, and we will see you next time.